I would like to start this panel with a bold, but I believe very credible assertion, and that is that what the world's growing population chooses to eat and how we produce, process, and distribute that food will be the single biggest driver of the health of the planet and of its people. I also think in the context of this particular forum, it's important to realize that beliefs that we hold individually and beliefs that societies hold will be a very significant driver of those choices, both about what we eat and how we get that food on the table. Beliefs about food and health, beliefs about social justice, even religious beliefs are very significant in influencing our food choices, which are woven through all aspects of the fabric of our lives. Today, we have a phenomenal group of people to talk about the challenge that we face in feeding the growing population. And we're going to, I hope, have a stimulating dialogue between ourselves and with you. We have sitting next to me Willy Foote, who is the founder and CEO of Root Capital. Next to Willy is Kathleen McLaughlin, who's the Senior Vice President of Sustainability and also the President of the Walmart Foundation. Jason Clay, who's the Senior Vice President of Markets and Food at the World Wildlife Fund. And last but not least, Jocelyn Wyatt, who's the co-founder and Executive Director of IDEO.org. And before we hear from our panelists, I want to take just a couple of minutes to provide some context about this issue that we're going to be talking about. First, I had to show you pigs, which I just happen to love. The production, distribution, all aspects of the food system are very, very significant consumers of the Earth's resources. And I thought it might be useful to share some of these statistics. Of course, there's a little debate about the precision, but the numbers that I'm going to share with you, I think, are pretty widely agreed to be in the ballpark. About 40% of the Earth's land surface is used for growing animals and plant crops. About 70% of the available fresh water, 20 to 30% of global energy. At least 20 to 30% of greenhouse gas emissions can be attributed to the food system. And if we think more broadly to the clearing of forests for agriculture, that number gets significantly higher. The number one cause of the destruction of natural habitats and species loss is related to agriculture. Also importantly, there is a very stark contrast between ag and the food system in more developed and less developed countries. Over the last 50 years, a relatively short period of time, the food system in developed countries has changed radically with incredible industrialization, consolidation of farms, and introduction of technology. We've significantly increased the amount of food that we produce. And in fact, in part, as a result to the way the food system has evolved, we have arguably over 1 billion people who are obese related to that food system. In less developed countries, it's a very different picture. There has been very, very little change in the production of food over the last 40 to 50 years, with very little technology being used, little processing, much food being eaten locally. Many of you are very familiar with these environments. The increase in the production of food has been inconsequential relative to what we've experienced in the developed world. And yet, when we look at population growth projections between now and 2050, this becomes a particularly disturbing reality. What you'll see on this chart, though it's hard to read the specific countries, the more developed countries are represented at the very top of this chart in the blue and green colors. the orange and red colors represent the less developed parts of the world. So as we look at the increases in population that we project, they will be in the countries that have the least developed food systems. This is another way of looking at that data, with the light blue on the top representing the less developed countries. And so we have about 500 million smallholder farm households producing about 70 to 80% of the food in Africa, many parts of South Asia, many parts of Latin America, in the least developed environments. And they are doing so without the benefit of the kinds of technology and advances that have occurred. So the question that we're going to grapple with on the panel is, as we look at this growing population very concentrated in the developing countries, how can we ensure that people are fed with less environmental damage than we're already experiencing from the food system, and without further disenfranchising these very marginalized populations who today are growing the majority of the food in the less developed environment? So I'd like to start this conversation with Jocelyn, because I think it's important. I teach human-centered design at the D School at Stanford. I'm a big believer in focusing on the people who you're designing for when looking at solutions, as is Jocelyn. And Jocelyn, you and your team have spent considerable time with smallholders, looking at their issues, their challenges, the kinds of solutions they need. Can you talk to us a little bit about that work and help us understand these people a little better?
Sure. So our experience with smallholders has mainly been in Africa. We did some work recently with the Rockefeller Foundation, where we were focused in Senegal and Kenya. And what we came to learn is that when we talk about smallholder farmers and we talk about the statistics related to them, we oftentimes think of them as a single group. And in fact, there are so many differences within that group of smallholder farmers, and I think it's important to sort of recognize what some of those differences are. So one of the frameworks that we came up with was really sort of addressing the fact that farming is a really unpredictable profession. There are things that are out of a farmer's control. The weather has such a tremendous effect on their crops. There are pest outbreaks. There are inputs that could be good or bad depending on who you buy them from and when. And so as we were thinking about this, we were recognizing that this unpredictability affects some smallholders much more than it affects others. And so the framework that we developed was really a pyramid, if you can imagine, with unstable farmers at the bottom, transitional farmers in the middle, and at the top, stable farmers. And so some of those predictors, or some of the things that sort of indicated whether a farmer would be unstable or transitional or stable, the first was income diversity. So if they had multiple ways or sources of income in their family, they're much more likely to be stable farmers. If they had savings, that also protected them against some of the shocks and bad seasons or bad climate, and that also allowed them to have more stability. If they had education and knew where to go for resources, if they had support networks and others around them that they could count on when times were tough, and if they had social capital where they could actually sort of pull favors from the people in those networks, that also allowed them to be more stable. And so as we understood this, then we started to look at what different solutions were, how we might work with unstable, transitional, and stable farmers in different ways. And so with the unstable farmers, they really are sort of living in the moment, and trying to introduce innovations to unstable farmers first, even though they may be most in need, very, very challenging. They tend to not really trust people outside of their immediate friends and family and neighbors. They sort of have this attitude, which is like, there's nothing I can do. It's just, it's up to the gods, or it's up to, fate, what's going to happen to me this season. And they're so cash-strapped that it's very challenging for them to invest in advance of the payoff. When we move to transitional farmers, what we really see is that they're starting to need to really develop soft skills. They're starting to think like business people, and they're starting to really have this issue, which is access to labor. And so when they need the labor the most, the labor is actually most expensive and most difficult to get. And so it's very hard for them to actually grow their farms because labor is really a mitigating factor. And then once we get to the stable farmers, they've been able to leapfrog the middleman, and so they're getting higher prices for their crops. They've been able to invest in technologies. They've been able to innovate and are really embracing innovation. And so, in our work, we really started to think about how do we use the stable farmers to work with the transitional farmers who then maybe can work with the unstable farmers to start to introduce innovations, to start to teach new skills, to start to form collaboratives, but really sort of recognize who the drivers of those new changes or innovations might be within communities of smallholder farmers.
Great. Thanks, Jocelyn. And Willy, that is sort of related to your work, the idea of having players who maybe are a little bigger, maybe pull together the efforts of some of these small folks and help them move forward. Can you talk about the importance and role of aggregators in trying to advance the smallholders' work?
Yeah, sure. It's great to be here. I'm really excited about this panel. So building on Jocelyn's comments, I'd say, let's just take at the smallholder level first. Productivity, for instance, is only one part of the equation. It's an important one, but we know what the productivity constraints are. You mentioned some of them. It's subscale farms. It's poor natural resources, soil depletion, water availability, erratic weather. It's lack of access to inputs and technology, so improved seed and say drip irrigation. But there are a lot of other non-productivity and even not at the smallholder level constraints for farmers that we need to address. And so, a lack of access to information on market prices, lack of insights on competitive forces, like what to produce, when to sell, lack of market linkages or absence, weak market linkages, poor infrastructure, so roads, trucks, post-harvest warehousing. In our case, very focused on the fact they're locked out of the banking system. So any sustainability vision for smallholders is going to kind of depend on addressing productivity constraints as well as the information infrastructure market access constraints. And that's where aggregators become so important, because the aggregator, I'm not talking about, say, a farmer cooperative or a private enterprise that might aggregate hundreds or thousands of farmers. And what they do is they provide the farmers to gain negotiating power in the marketplace, right? So they can, you're organizing formerly disaggregated farmers, you're combining their production, you're connecting them into modern markets. And then secondly, and just as important, that the aggregators can be service providers to farmers with last mile distribution capability, right? And so very remote rural areas, often the first service provider is the aggregator for essential inputs and credit and technology. So from there, and Kathleen will probably talk about this, but if you can plug aggregators into differentiated, tighter value chains, really great things can happen. You get that two-way exchange of value where services through the aggregators are going to farmers and the farmers are providing higher quality, more reliable product to the buyers. And in our experience, the aggregators are often the critical kind of link that ties together sustainability, traceability, reliability. So often they're the vehicle through which upstream sustainability initiatives reach farmers. So there could be certification programs in the US or Europe. It could be sustainability initiatives within large multinationals. They're also often the conduit through which on-the-ground investments at the farmer level filter back up through the buyers. And maybe lastly, they're a critical, not the only, but probably one of the most important entry points for folks like us. Specialized intermediaries of capital capacity building. It could be banks, if and where willing, but Aru Capital, TechnoServe, so many others that are focused on both productivity issues and these constraints around capital, qualified employees, market access. The aggregator often is really what allows you to let 1,000 flowers bloom.
Great, thank you. So I think one of the things, and you touched on this, that is exciting, encouraging, and concerning on some dimensions about this space is that all kinds of players are participating, ranging from the least stable smallholders that Jocelyn mentioned to very large global organizations. I think that's good because this is a hard problem and we need everyone collaborating and working together to solve it, and building the right kinds of collaboration is a challenge. So Jason, why don't you tell us a little bit about the multi-stakeholder work that you have been doing through the World Wildlife Fund to get at some of these issues of environmental impact and loss of species?
So as an organization, we've realized that the work we've done over the past 50 years in conservation will be lost entirely if we don't get where and how we produce food right. So we've begun to staff up both agriculture and livestock operations to help make those systems more sustainable. And we've identified certain commodities that we think have the biggest impact, both on biodiversity and ecosystem services. But the idea is to understand what better production looks like and establish standards and verification programs that allow us to move producers along a continuum from worse production to better production. And there's hundreds of different certification programs out there today. But I think the goal for most of us by 2050 would be to double net food availability. And I say it that way because we need to both focus on productivity and efficiency, but also reducing waste and changing consumption. And we've got to work on all of those things simultaneously. No one strategy is going to get us there. But the biggest issue, you mentioned population. Population increase is going to be about 25%, 30% by 2050. Consumption is at least going to double across the board, per capita consumption. And there's no end in sight. You saw the population flatten out around 2050, consumption just keeps going. We have no idea when it's going to stop or how it's going to stop. And with food, that poses some real issues to the environment. So we started with commodities of concern. We pulled together multi-stakeholder groups, producers all the way through retailers and brands, but also university researchers, NGOs, government officials, and others who had an interest, and input suppliers. It was a multi-stakeholder group for each of these commodities. It was science-based. Today, one of the biggest issues in food is that we have 7.3 billion food experts on the planet, and they don't agree on anything. And so we need a science-based discussion. We can argue about the data, but let's at least use data as opposed to assumptions or dare I say, beliefs at this conference. But we need to also be focused. We can't work on 1,000 things. So how do we really narrow down the number of things we're working on to 6 or 8? And then focus on performance, not on practices. If you ask producers to comply with practices, that's what you get, compliance. If you ask them to meet a performance level, then what you get is innovation. And what we need going forward is innovation more than anything. We need to figure out how to get better. So these standard setting groups are also intended to be scale neutral, and some are more successful than others. It depends on the commodity, frankly. What they do, in fact, I think, is create awareness about problems that people weren't even aware of. They build consensus about what is possible and about what the key issues are that we need to focus on. They have each player along the value chain can then take up their own areas of strategic focus. We can begin to understand what is possible at the farm level, what better farmers can do, and then make the business case for that and show how that can actually be viable and why you don't necessarily need premiums to actually move producers towards more sustainable production, and then you can accelerate change. So what's wrong with this system of certification? It takes too long. It takes us 10 years to develop good standards between when you start recruiting people to come to the table and when you actually agree on the final standards. It takes another 10 years to achieve any kind of market penetration, 5, 10, 15%. 20 years at least is way too long. The world is changing much faster than that. But there's actually even a more fundamental problem. The tool isn't fit for purpose. And what I mean by that is certification rewards the better producers. The bottom 25% of producers in any commodity produce 50% of the impacts and 10% of the product. If you want to change productivity, if you want to increase production and you want to reduce environmental impacts, you focus on the bottom 25%. You don't focus on the top. And that poses huge reputational risks for those people who care about this, because it means you have to work with the worst companies, not the best ones. And that's a whole different strategy. So you've got to figure out how to do it. But I think the bigger issue here that we've seen, and this I would say is what is fit for purpose for NGOs, or for those change agents that are trying to work in this space, is they often do it at the expense of the very institutions that we need to strengthen. We need NGOs to stop doing and start influencing. How do you build the finance sector that addresses these issues? How do you build the governance structures that address these? We don't need parallel institutions, and we don't need redundancy. We actually need the institutions to do what they're supposed to do. So I think we at least as an organization, have really begun to challenge this thinking. And here's the final question, which I'll just pose. In the last 35 years, and some of us have been working in this space for even longer than that, actually, all of our efforts of all the certification, all the better production, all the commitments around deforestation free, and all the different kinds of commitments companies, governments, et cetera, are making, we've created $100 billion of demand per year for better products. We haven't yet figured out how to turn that demand into leveraging investments in more sustainable production. How do we do that? That's the real challenge of the 21st century. And it's going to come down to things like long-term contracts, pooling commitments, so that Unilever and Nestle are both committing to sustainable products because they both buy from the same farmers on any given day. So these are the kinds of things that we need to start thinking about. I'll stop there.
Great. Thanks, Jason. And Kathleen, that's a nice setup for you in that in your role where you have both mainstream business responsibilities and the foundation, you're certainly involved in both certifications or standards requirements for producers and supporting some of the least strong, capable ag players to get stronger and more capable. So can you talk a little bit about some of the things that Walmart is doing?
Sure, yeah, I'd be happy to. Food is our biggest business at Walmart, and we're the world's largest food retailer. So solving the problem that Jason just described is a central interest for us. How do we have a world where we have 70% more net food availability in a way that doesn't cut down every last tree, use every last drop of water, in a way that actually works with the people who are in the system today, the smallholders, right, and the people who eat food, which last time I checked is everybody, right? So this is a problem we're hard at work on. And for us, we're trying to drive a more sustainable food system across the whole set of commodities that we trade in. So that means environmental sustainability, affordability, access, healthier food, safety, transparency, a whole raft of things. When it comes to smallholders, we believe that there is a critical role that retailers can play in helping smallholders thrive and helping them be part of the solution to produce more food in a way that's environmentally sustainable and sustainable for those families, for those farmers. And we're doing it in a few ways. So one is through our own sourcing. So we spend about $4 billion a year at cost sourcing from small and medium farmers today. Some of that's cotton, a fair amount of it is cotton, a lot of it is horticulture. And when we do that, you had mentioned longer term contracts. We found that that's quite important. That if we go into Central America or into Ghana or Kenya or what have you, and we can bring a longer term commitment to purchase of a volume of a crop and guidance around timing of when we need that crop, what are the specifications and so on, that creates an environment that attracts other people in to help. So it attracts folks who come in with training, so the USAIDs of the world, TechnoServe's 1 Acre Fund, all these folks that we tend to work with, to help train those farmers in more sustainable ag techniques that are also higher yield producing techniques. It also is starting to attract capital, other people's capital, in to build out processing infrastructure or transportation infrastructure, some of the things you talked about, Willy, that are missing. And it works for everybody, because you now have a situation, if you're producing passion fruit or cashews or what have you, where the yields are better. It's better for the environment. There's more value-added crop being produced. There's the comfort and de-risking of that longer-term contract, and a reason to have a more value-added ag sector. So it really is a good example of triple bottom line impact. The second thing that we can bring to it as the customer is some standards, not only around sustainability and what we'd like to see in terms of fertilizer application and water usage and so on, but also some other things. Women. Role of women farmers, and we've put a real premium on that in our projects to make sure that the women are participating and that they're thriving as well. The third thing that retailers can bring to the table, going back to your point about waste, is whole crop utilization. So if we're taking cashews or we're taking tomatoes or what have you, apples is a good example in China, we're using the whole fruit. So the beautiful ones we'll put on the shelf, the ugly ones we can make into apple juice or other kinds of products, applesauce, what have you. Cashews, right? Our aspiration in cashews is to start working with the whole plant. So juice the fruit and use the nuts and the broken ones and the shells and use the whole thing. We're not there yet. It's something that we're working on, but it's something that we have a real interest in and think we can play a role in doing. And then the last thing I'd say is philanthropy. So you'd mentioned the foundation. One of the reasons that at Walmart we've brought our sustainability team together with our foundation globally is that we would like to be able to use either philanthropy or our business assets through commerce to drive the social and environmental outcomes. And so you can think of it as a palette that we're drawing from based on the outcome we're trying to achieve. So one of the things we've committed to is training farmers. So we committed a few years ago to train 1 million farmers around the world. And it was a commitment we made without actually counting the farmers that we had access to, and we learned that, gosh, it's actually hard to get to 1 million farmers. But we've been hard at it through many partners. A lot of you guys in the room actually are working with us on this. So Gates Foundation, TechnoServe, Mercy Corps, 1 Acre Fund, USAID, everybody and his brother who touches farmers. You guys, we're trying to work with to get to them. And that's philanthropy. So those folks that we're training, it's not in the fields necessarily where we're sourcing from. It is about elevating the practices in the sector so that we can have better outcomes for women farmers. We can look at the livelihoods of farmers, look at the sustainability practices and so on. One of the commitments that we made last year at the UN Climate Change Summit is to start tracking across our entire food production base, so not just smallholders and medium-sized farmers, but all of our suppliers, including some of the big ones. Yields, water usage, and GHG. And obviously there are a lot of other things we worry about too, pollinator health and so on. But those 3 metrics, to start tracking them across our supply base, to try to get the world to start tracking and having traceability back to practices at the farm. So that's another thing we can bring, is just technology and the ability to start to measure and ask for the metrics to be gathered.
Great, thank you. So both you and Jason mentioned some, I think, really positive innovations like long-term purchasing commitments that can really help encourage innovation and progress among the smallholders. It's often hard to get those changes widely adopted. And one of the things that I've been wondering about is we've got some big disruptions happening because many of us think because of climate change. I suppose there's some debate about that, but things like coffee rust and things like the funguses that are attacking the cocoa plants. So I'm interested, let's start with you, Willy. I know you've been very involved in trying to deal with the coffee issue with the coffee growers. How can these kinds of pretty abrupt and scary disruptions fuel new approaches and innovations? And what are some of the things that you're doing in coffee?
Yeah, great. It's a great build on this. It's, never let a crisis go to waste, right? And a crisis, especially an industry-wide crisis and challenge can accelerate some of these dynamics that Kathleen and Jocelyn talking about. So coffee leaf rust, some of you might have read about it. It's hit the front page of the papers over the past year and a half or so. It's this fungus that is just decimating coffee production really across the Americas. Many suggest it's climate change in terms of higher temperatures and more erratic weather that has just created the perfect conditions for it to just to spread like wildfire. And it's really been awful. 70% of production has been affected in Central America. You've lost 500,000 coffee-related jobs, $1 billion plus in revenue forgone. But what's the silver lining, and it really is a silver lining along these lines, is that it has galvanized a diversity of players to take action, who don't necessarily take action in a coordinated fashion. So industry leaders, policymakers, international development community, what we've tried to do is to use this window of opportunity as but one of those players to kind of channel momentum toward creating a blueprint for collaboration, if you will, that helps to improve income and livelihoods for the farmers, but also stabilizes the value chains, the global value chains that rely on the farmers. So it's kind of the learning agenda there is we want to address Roya, coffee leaf rust, but we want to kind of learn and understand how do you create these multi-stakeholder approaches, right? And kind of study them, and how do you really leverage a diversity of actors and their distinct assets and capabilities, and do so in a way that actually addresses an industry-wide challenge. So we're just really quickly, in a nutshell, 3 buckets where we're making investments. One is around long-term financing for coffee renovation and resilience investment. So that looks like 7+ year loans that we are making and crowding in other financiers for both total refurbishment of the coffee farm with either just brand new plant stock or, where it's available, rust-resistant varietals, and then also investments in plant nurseries and like centralized composting and fertilizer plants and eco-pulpers, et cetera. And interestingly, to Jason's point, a big part of this is market engagement, where we're getting buyers like Starbucks and Keurig Green Mountain to commit long-term to secure the offtake. And so that actually mitigates risk as a lender. So that's thing one, long-term investing. Thing two is around advisory. So we're actually 2 things there. Providing a lot of financial management training so that the aggregators, the farmer organizations on the ground, can better forecast their cash flows, can prepare the loan applications, which are, a much more sophisticated endeavor if you're projecting cash flows out all the 7-10 years. And then also doing a lot of internal credit management training, which is, in other words, like creating a savings and loan cooperative capacity within the farmer organization, interestingly with a lot of funding from corporates, so that they can lend as a farmer aggregator to the individual farmers. And then we're doing, and this is new for us, and it's largely a partnership strategy, agronomic training, so that the plant management programs of varietal selection, the whole farm planning is done in a really robust way. And again, if you're city or if you're root capital and you're lending to the farmers, you're really exposed unless that plant is the farm's getting the love that they need. And the third bucket, and maybe it's the most important one long term from say, and this goes back to what Jocelyn said, is income diversification, right? Strategies and food security and nutrition. So on the one hand, helping to develop and launch side businesses, so that they move into animal husbandry, fish farming, poultry, and on the other hand, that they start to grow with kind of sustainable intensification, short cycle crops like beans and rice or whatever, and then also honey, a lot of diversification into honey and cocoa and other things. So again, the key objective is blueprinting the collaboration, because A, it's needed for coffee in many other places, and like it or not, it's going to hit Africa sooner. And if it's not this biblical scourge, it'll be another one. But actually taking it in conversations with Walmart and Costco and others, taking it into quinoa and Kellogg's, and taking it into cocoa, and taking it into cashew, these type of collaborations. And just quickly, the partners. So we have Keurig, Green Mountain, and Starbucks, who've really stepped up with funding, as well as long-term market commitments, and a number of other more, if you will, activist companies, like an Equal Exchange and Cooperative Coffees. We have USAID through the Development Credit Authority providing guarantees, and the Global Development Alliance, interestingly, matching dollar for dollar the money coming from the corporates to invest in agronomic training, financial training. And in one case, the corporate booked it as cost of goods sold. versus out of the foundation, which I think is a super exciting development. It's like way outside of corporate social responsibility. And then the IDB multilateral fund, IDB MEF, coming in with loan capital and subsidy to kind of get this thing off the ground. Skoll, God bless, provided a grant to kind of conceptualize this whole initiative. Root Capital is doing a lot of financing and advising, and we've got some peer institutions who are crowding in as well. And then there's a whole network of local NGOs that are providing the agronomic training. And then lastly, research institutes, universities to do the baseline impact studies. Last thing I'll say here, a kind of final point, is accepting, and this is maybe the most important point of the whole week in my mind, accepting, understanding, embracing the role of blended capital, right? How do I 100% market return and negative 100% returns, and combining the capital so that you maximize social benefit, you minimize subsidy on the way to commercial viability, and you create these kind of sometimes messy, but I think necessarily so, blueprints for collaboration amongst all these multiple stakeholders. So never let a crisis go to waste.
Terrific. Well, on the theme, because I want to stay on that theme for a minute, I think in my experience, huge change almost never comes without some kind of crisis. And Jason, you've been very involved in this with cocoa. And so just build on or add some new things around some of the innovations that you've seen, at least in experimental phase, coming out of trying to respond to these threats to supply.
Let me just respond to some of the things that you said, because I think it's very similar between cocoa and coffee. In the short term, climate smart agriculture is about efficiency and productivity. And it's about the fact that stress from climate change is going to cause every disease to have more of an impact than it would otherwise. But in the medium term, 6 to 10 years, it means changing your crop to something totally different, or changing the genetics. And it's going to call out in spades what we think about genetics and what we're willing to accept in genetics or not, because to meet climate change's impacts on the environment, we're going to have to act very quickly, that in a way that conventional breeding is not going to do. So we're going to have to use marker-assisted breeding to get traits, whether it's drought tolerance, disease resistance, et cetera. You can talk about transgenetics and you can make different decisions about that, but farmers are going to have to address this issue. I think the real potential that we're just starting to explore with cocoa, where 8 companies and 7 countries represent 85 to 90% of cocoa consumption and production. So you've got a real concentration. You can actually do something if you can get everybody on the same page. And the page, I would say cocoa is about a $5 billion of this $100 billion question. So how do we use that demand to change supply? Well, and cocoa isn't the best example of this, but in general, we need to figure out how to align incentives along the supply chain. One way to do that with this is to get the demand to leverage investments into more sustainable production. And we can start with the aggregation points, wherever there's processing and value added or some kind of change in the commodity that's been produced. So palm oil or sugar mills or pulp and paper plants or other types of aggregation, cotton gins, et cetera. When you've got that potential, you can invest in those aggregators and they can reinvest in the smaller holders that they're buying from. With the case of tree crops, we have the unique opportunity to use these long-term contracts to actually make 7, 10-year investments where as they're made in the processing plant, but as they're off-lent and then repaid, I think we could get really innovative here and set it up so that as the farmers repay their loans and as the aggregation plants use some of the money to upgrade their technology to become more efficient, we could actually vest producers with some equity in those processing plants. That's never been done. And that's a kind of diversification of income that would be great, because you're increasing the asset base of farmers, not just from the crops, but from an equity position, maybe 5%, 10%, whatever. It's a totally different way to approach this. So that's where I think we could really hit one out of the park here. But we need to start working together and figuring out how to do that and then develop some test cases.
Terrific. So I am going to give you guys a chance to ask questions. I want to get a couple more inputs into the conversation first. So I want to come back to the smallholders. And Jocelyn, I know you've had a chance to work on actually getting some innovation adopted on the ground with smallholder farms. We've been talking about some really exciting innovation that's happening at the commodity level in some of these areas that will get continuously rolled out. Talk to us about some of your experience in actually using human-centered design to get innovation to happen with smallholders.
Yeah, so what we've seen, we've done work with Juhudi Kalimo in Kenya and Digital Green in India, and worked with both of them to really help disseminate innovations to the smallholder farmers that they're working with. And I think what we've seen across the board is that there truly is a desire and a capacity to innovate amongst smallholder farmers. I think that we need to be really thoughtful about the ways in which we both introduce those new practices or new technologies, and then the way we support the adoption of those. And so oftentimes what will happen is that there's maybe a session that's held for the smallholder farmers, or a demonstration or a training, and then they don't actually have to put into practice that technique for another 6 weeks, and 6 weeks later they remember a third of the directions that they heard and not the other 2/3, and the binder that they got from the training is not something that they're really able to read, and they end up with all of these questions and sort of doing the new innovation kind of halfway, which ends up not working. And so, we've worked a lot to think about, how do we sort of distribute the information through communities of smallholder farmers so that there are experts within the community that can be called upon in the moment when one is trying this new technique of planting or whatever it is, or how can we develop really low-cost call centers for farmers to be able to access information in the moments in which they need it. I think that there's another challenge, which is the introduction of innovations that require farmers spending money or investing in those innovations. And there, I think, is if we go back to the model of the unstable, transitional, and stable farmers, I think that's where introducing a new planter or a new dryer or a new technology that requires investment, the easiest way to go, really, and the only way to start out, I believe, is to start with the stable farmers, to get them to use that new technology, to invest in it, and then to show their neighbors and families and friends how that works and how that has increased their incomes. And so the trust is built through those communities, and so innovations really do need to be disseminated through networks and communities of farmers, rather than sort of through great marketing campaigns or other ways where you're just not going to get the unstable farmers to pay for that in advance. And I think this goes back to what Willy was saying. I mean, we need to think about different financing mechanisms to be able to support smallholder farmers investing in new technologies. And how do we help alleviate some of that risk or the necessity for upfront payment for new technologies, and how do we actually match the payments with the cash flows that they're receiving to make it more tenable for them to be able to invest and ultimately increase their yields and increase their incomes.
Great, thank you. So, Kathleen, I want to talk about the final topic that I'd like to have introduced in this panel, which is metrics. Mm-hmm. And I think most of us, especially who've worked in any kind of broad market or multi-stakeholder environment, have seen the power of metrics to get people aligned around moving forward toward an outcome. Mm-hmm. And I know Walmart has really been a leader in developing and spreading some key environmental metrics in the agriculture space. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that work.
Yeah, so maybe I'll talk about it in general and then come back to the context of smallholders, because it is a little bit different. We are trying to facilitate a harmonized set of tools and standards in the food system for measuring inputs and outputs, and those would include not only things like water and other kinds of inputs, fertilizer and so on, but outputs around yield, and then things that go beyond efficiency, so pollinator health, animal welfare, and so on. I think as a world of food producers and consumers, we've got a long way to go on that. But one of the things we've done is we invested a few years ago in an organization called the Sustainability Consortium. And it's a bunch of scientists from Arizona State and University of Arkansas that banded together and did pretty detailed life cycle analysis on a whole range of commodities, food and non-food. Mm-hmm. And so we have a pretty good sense through that work about what the environmental and social issues are in almost every chain that we engage in at Walmart. And we're using those insights and the survey tools that the Sustainability Consortium has created to ask our suppliers to tell us on an annual basis how are they doing across their production volumes against those issues. So in row crops, for example, there's a set of questions around those things I just mentioned, and we're now starting to link up with some other schemes like Field to Market and CISC and so on that the industry has also begun to adopt to harmonize those and have a simple way for farmers to report back on those metrics. And so the commitment we made to the UN is that we're going to continue to work on this, and we'll keep reporting and aggregate where we stand, and our hope is over time that we'll have a pretty good picture. And that clarity will drive change. If people understand what is happening in terms of greenhouse gas or water pollution or human issues, they'll work on those things. So when it comes to smallholders, how do you apply this? Because as you quite rightly said, Jocelyn, the last thing we want to do is come in and burden people who are barely surviving with one, and we'd now like you to report on these 20 things. So what we've been doing is with our partners, working with them to basically band-aid or bring some of those things to the table. So for example, we have a project right now, it's a USAID project, Feed the Future project in Bangladesh with the IFDC that's about micro applications of fertilizer and looking at yields and so on. And so we have been working with USAID to supplement that project and add in 40,000 women farmers, women smallholders. And the project team was already collecting this kind of data. So they're doing it with women as well, and they're looking at women's incomes and so on. So it's not really burdening the smallholders, it's the people working on the project that are doing it. One of the things I hope that we learn in that project and many others that we're doing across our million farmers that we're working on training is learn how can we collect these metrics in a better way. So can we use cell phones, mobile technology for folks just to record some basic things? What are some low-cost, easy ways to start tracking some of this stuff? And then use it to the benefit of the smallholders. So the insights that are coming out are not just for the world to see what's happening, but for people to make better decisions in the actual field. So.
Terrific. Did you want to say something?
Can I do a quick build on that one? Yeah.
Sure.
So I just really want to punctuate what you just said. So an example for us where we would call it almost like a philosophically client-centered impact measurement, where you're creating as an imperative always, not taxing but creating management value or farmer value through the data that you're collecting. And so, for instance, we a few years ago moved from an exclusive focus on export cash crop value chains into local supply chains for nutritious foods. And seed companies we've been working with in East Africa, where we said, okay, you all want to have voice of customer information on your individual farmers to serve them better and to be more sustainable as a business. We want to have purchase out of progress index surveys, progress out of poverty index surveys. So we'll put both of those onto a survey and an SMS technology, and we're creating value for the company and serving their farmers better, and we're able to learn more about how we deepen our impact. And another thing in the past year or so, I can think of any number of examples in Peru and elsewhere, where we're digitizing the paper-based certification information and enabling them to actually make decisions around agronomic practices, for instance, that up their game versus it's just sitting there on some shelf, the paper-based information. So there's a lot of pent-up demand at the aggregator level, at the farmer level, for being able to kind of bring cloud-based, et cetera, type of efficiencies to the data collection.
I think that this thing about metrics is interesting. And that's why we've always focused on 6 or 8 things, because we can't measure 1,000. But if we can choose the most important, and just to give you an example from cotton and smallholders in India and Pakistan, where we've been working a lot, we've actually certified 680,000 producers, and they have collectively reduced pesticide use by 60% because they're starting to manage it now. They've also reduced water use by 40% and synthetic fertilizer use by 30%, but they've increased income 15 to 20% without any premiums. It's all about the efficiency. Now, the lesson I would take from that is it's in their best interest to manage better. That's why they're doing it. So pollinators are kind of a $5 word, as we used to say in Missouri. And that's not necessarily the farmer's interest. The farmer's interest is in more production. So if you can show them the connection between pollinators and increased productivity, they will manage the pollinators because they're getting more food from it, and particularly with your fruits and vegetables and things. So I think we just have to figure out how to harmonize all these efforts globally around metrics to really come up with a 6 or 8 or 10, whatever, but some manageable number that we can really move on.
Great. Okay. Now, it's your big opportunity in the audience. So first of all, I realized I failed to give you the spiel at the beginning. It's Friday. I figure you already know. Obviously, no one's phone was ringing, so thank you for silencing your phones. Feel free to tweet away all the brilliant things that you're hearing in the panel if you haven't already. And I have a couple requests with regard to questions. It's imperative, I am told, that you have a microphone in your hand before asking a question. Please introduce yourself, and please, please, please don't make speeches, but keep questions or comments very short. And we're going to take a couple and then have the panel reply. And we have hands down here in the front.
Hi, I'm Lamia. I'm a food entrepreneur between Morocco and the US. And it's amazing to see how everybody's talking about smallholder farmers, but no one is mentioning artisans from local markets. And actually, this would help empower all the value-added brands and get them shelf space to get the actually more stable farmers and more stable ecosystems. So what actions are made today to empower this kind of players? Thank you.
Great.
Charlie Walker with the Breadfruit Institute. We plant trees that grow food for 80 to 100 years. The question I have is, amongst the panelists, do you see an increasing emphasis on agriculture that emphasizes sustainability? And that is the difference between planting a plant that produces food for many, many years as opposed to the cycle that we're in with agriculture, where you have to plow fields and plant seeds every year, which is a different way, higher yield, but nonetheless creates a whole other set of problems, particularly in third world settings.
Okay. Got one right here. Let's go here because we've got a mic here.
Oh, hi. I think a lot of the conversation has been about how to improve the efficiency of the food suppliers wherever they're producing food. You haven't really talked very much about the other end of the equation, which is the kind of food that we eat or that we ask people to make for us. I'm just interested to know what you all think about that, really. So, using, say, meat, for example. If meat consumption is a big problem, what are your views on getting people to eat less of it, or coming up with different ways of making that more efficient?
Okay, terrific. Let's let the panel address those, and then we'll get some more. So 3 questions. One was, what about supporting food artisans who would help build markets for the fruits of the fields of farmers, as it were? What's the perspective on planting longer-lived plants as opposed to annual row crops? And what about influencing food choice to move the sustainability of the food system? So I'll throw those 3 out there for folks to respond to. Willy?
I'll take a couple of them. Great question regarding food consumption. In our case, with the markets that we're serving in Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa, we've had a big focus on, for instance, import substitution of rice in West Africa for the grains, millet, sorghum, the traditional grains that are highly nutritious and drought resistant and so on, and trying to bring, if you will, food sovereignty from the traditional grains back to those consumer markets. So, and I'm purposefully not talking about meat in the United States, I'm talking about consumption of nutritious foods in country and local supply chains and all of the economic benefits that come from income retention in country. So that's a really important development, and the danger there is if you've got a quinoa, for instance, a superfood. A month ago I was in northern Peru and we're financing Sasha Inchik, which is think like a mix between a soybean and a peanut, and it's a terrific omega-3 and omega-6 in the oil. But if like quinoa, you're not careful, it can be a gold rush to the point where nobody's eating quinoa anymore because in the highlands of Bolivia, because it's all being exported to the United States. So you got to figure out what's the right balance there, but there's no question that that's a huge part of calibrating sustainable food production with what's most nutritious and most appropriate for the local ecoecology, and things like sorghum and millet and fonio and so on are terrific examples. Quickly on the sustainability around plants and our choices and what we're growing. This is just totally anecdotal, but a fascinating example of this conundrum. So how did Colombia, as in Republic of, respond to the coffee leaf rust crisis I mentioned? Well, they've responded in a very smart way from a yield perspective, and they got their yields, which dropped down to this unprecedented level of 7 or 8 million sacks, back up to 12 to 14 million sacks. But they did it by introducing a highly agrochemically dependent racehorse variety of coffee called Castillo, which has a flavor profile that may or may not meet the long-term needs of the specialty market. But it's a lot of the farmers who, up until Roya hit, had the old school, very much shade-grown, Arabica, Bourbons, etc. They're denuded. They're no longer there. Whereas in Nicaragua and other places, there's been, in some respects, because they don't have a command and control centralized governmental response, the farmers are simply saying, you know what, I just want to have newer plants and my old-fashioned coffee plants that thrive under the shade of the canopy of the jungle. And they're two very different examples. One, I think, will probably get Colombia into trouble long-term, even though short-term, if you look at it kind of like GDP, yields are really up, but sustainability is down.
That's a good example.
Jocelyn.
Yeah, so to take on the question of both sort of shifting food consumption and then also artisans, I think one of the things that we saw was we were working in Kenya, and in Kenya they were trying to introduce banana flour as sort of an alternative flour. And as we talked with the women, one of the challenges they said was we're totally into this idea. We grow bananas here, and this seems like a great product, but we don't know how to cook with banana flour. And so I think we need to think about, and I think that this is a role that food artisans can play, which is how can they actually introduce and start to experiment with new recipes? How can they spread the word about new ways of cooking with local food? I think that the local food movement is certainly happening across these communities, but it's not something that's celebrated as it is in the UK or the US. And so how can we actually sort of start to make that more of a movement and something that is more celebrated about eating locally? And then how can we actually have the food artisans help teach local communities how they might shift to different types of grains or different foods that might be more sustainable or healthier in the long term?
I can just add to that. So we do have a number of projects that are working with small producers, artisans. So for example, in Mexico, last year, 2014, we trained about 10,000 producers of artisanal goods and food goods in a partnership with TechnoServe and Ashoka and a couple of other local Mexican NGOs. And we sold those products in Walmart stores, and the income of those producers went up by about 60% because, to your point, it's more value-added goods, and it worked pretty well. We do have challenges with scaling that kind of thing. So in our Women's Economic Empowerment Initiative, we've had something called Empowering Women Together, which was focused on women producers of artisanal goods. And what we found was to supply into Walmart at scale, the audits required, the safety procedures, the protocols, compliance, all of this sort of burden to supply 10,000 stores, right? And just the production capacity that they needed to have, and also the nature of the goods. It's sort of fashion goods that people might buy one time as a gift, but you aren't going to buy it every week, right? So to sustain the demand for the products, all of those things are very real challenges that frankly we haven't figured out as a large retailer. So it's something we're working on and we'll continue to chip away at. Jason.
So 3 different observations on the questions. One on consumption. I've been struck by the fact that the focus of most of the seed companies and global agribusiness has been to extend temperate crops into the tropics. these annual crops, et cetera. We had started a project about a year ago with Mars, Beijing Genomic Institute, NEPAD in Africa, and IBM to map the genomes of the 101 most important food crops in Africa so that we could actually increase productivity of local crops rather than bring in new crops. And 33 of those have already been mapped. We're training 90 plant breeders a year in marker-assisted breeding to help actually bring productivity of the crops being consumed in places where there's going to be more income and consumption. So why not do local crops? That's one thing. The second is on the artisans. Brazil's success in school lunch programs has always struck me as really interesting. They built the entire export poultry industry based on the shoulders of this, but that's one model. We don't have to accept the model even though we want to accept the results. So could we actually use local artisans and food providers to do school lunch programs in a much more decentralized program to stimulate value-added production and to use government resources to pay what they're already buying anyway, but from local producers? So there would be a way, I think, to do that. And then finally, if you look at the UNFCCC maps of tree crops by 2025, 2020, some cases 2030, in every case, where we currently grow crops, tree crops, will not be suitable for production with the current genetic material we have. Right. What are we going to do in those places? So even tree crops aren't long-term, in the long term. We've got to figure out how to do this, and I think it's probably going to be some kind of continuous change and mix. Mexico is the only country I'm aware of where the government is actually looking at what the next crop after coffee is. No other country is doing that kind of thinking yet, that kind of anticipatory thinking of what the impacts of climate change are going to be.
Okay, we have one. Oh, we've got many hands. We need microphones moving fast. Actually, I want one over here. He had his hand up before. Thank you. And then we'll go here.
Hi, I just wanted to ask, we had some discussion in the panel about controlling wastage, particularly in the supply chain. But yeah, I was reading an article recently that almost about 40% of food in New York restaurants and supermarkets is thrown away. I don't know what the statistic for Walmart might be. Are there any thoughts of, that's food that's already there, what we could do to save that food?
Great, and can you introduce yourself?
Sorry, my name is Farouk Khan from Acumen.
Wonderful, thank you. And here?
Yes, this is Michael Kabori. I'm head of sustainability at Levi Strauss & Company. So interested in the relationship between price premiums and the ability to scale sustainable commodities. So Jason, you mentioned something very interesting, which is that, through better cotton, they've been able to scale to about 18% of the global cotton market without introducing price premiums. Yep. So what's the relationship there? And by introducing premiums, can we scale, and are we also limiting to those in wealthy countries that can afford to pay that premium?
Okay, and we have a mic over here. Let's go right here.
Graham McMillan from Citi. Just a question to Kathleen. Coming from a similar structure in a similarly large organization, but to a degree much smaller, which is amazing. Wanting to know, these are very big, complex issues, as is your institution, and how does Walmart internally, among Treasury, Finance, Procurement, Technology, Sustainability, Foundation, how are you all coordinated internally to address these multivariant issues internally? And then there are a few of you, I suspect, much like there are at Citi, bringing this together to work with partners. How do you manage all of that? And do you have any advice for us? Because we know it's not easy, but maybe you're doing some things that are helpful.
And we'll take one more. Cindy.
Hi, Cindy Chen from the Skoll Foundation. In our conversation about food, we've been focused on smallholder farmers, and I wonder how and if smallholder fishermen and fisher folk should be included in the conversation. Thanks.
Okay, so the questions on the table.
Maybe I'll just run through the ones that quickly. So food waste, yeah, it's a big deal. As you said, it's not all making more food, it's wasting less food is at least half the solution. And the numbers that we've seen, there have been various studies, but let's imagine 33% of food gets wasted. 16 is upstream in the field. 16 is in the home. It's all the lunch meat that we throw out and the vegetables in the back of the fridge. only 1% is actually in the retail part of the chain, but that's still a lot. So what we've been doing within Walmart in our own food system, stuff in our DCs and in our stores, is managing that wastage down, and our goal is 0% food throwaways. We do it in a couple of ways. One is just by better ordering versus demand predictions and so on and so forth. But the other is we have now a pretty sophisticated food donation system that we have stood up in many of our markets around the world. In the US in particular, we donate $1 billion worth of food a year into Feeding America. And we've also worked extensively with them to give them refrigerated trucks, logistics expertise, to create a stronger cold chain so that we can have a healthier charitable meal system, and we're trying to get more fresh product into that system. So our goal is never, ever throw out meat, eggs, vegetables, et cetera, but to get that before it's inedible into the food chain. So that's one. There's a lot of other stuff we could talk about upstream, transportation infrastructure, whole crop utilization, things like that we need to work on. And then in the kitchen, there is a need to rationalize our best buy, use before, et cetera, messaging on food. It's very confusing to people. It's inconsistent. Folks are throwing things away that are perfectly fine to eat in the home. So that's another one that we're starting to work on with consumer education and so on, but a long way to go. So that's that one. There was a second question on cost of food and premiums. Our goal is to keep food affordable, right? We really care about that. That's the whole Walmart mission, is to help people save money. And so what we have found is, for the most part, a sustainable solution is one that uses fewer resources and by definition ought to be cheaper. When you're using less fertilizer, when you're using less pesticides and herbicides and so on, when you're managing your inputs, that's lower cost. So our focus is on that. And we found so far, in just about every situation, we've been able to elevate farmer income because we're taking costs out and waste out of the system. That said, there is a premium on healthier versions of SKUs versus unhealthy. Why does something with less sodium or sugar cost more than the thing without? And we're focused on that too. So we track it, and we have about we had a 6% premium on the healthier version of a SKU versus the less healthy, and our goal is to get it down to 0 or less, and we're down to about 5.1 now. So we're just, we've just been at it for a couple of years. So we're chipping away at that. That's very important. And we're trying to lower the price of food. The third one was about our organization. Yeah, it's interesting. At Walmart, it's very embedded into the organization, sustainability, so that there's a very clear vision amongst the leadership team about our role. Our role as a business is to not only deliver our main business mission, which is bringing food and apparel to people that's affordable, but it's to strengthen the systems that we rely on. That's an obligation, and that's baked into the metrics and goals for the merchants, the operators, the engineers, everybody. So the engineers around Walmart are all focused on their energy efficiency targets and greenhouse gas. The operators are measured on waste in the store, and they have a big readout at the end of every day. If you go to Asda here in the UK, at the end of the day, they all huddle around and go, okay, what did we throw away? Why did you throw away that bread? That should have been marked down or donated. Like, it's very disciplined. And then the same thing with the merchants. They have metrics around sustainability that are linked to those scores on the index that I mentioned. And so they're asked, okay, what are you doing to work on your sustainability scores? And we ask our suppliers that too. So if that didn't happen, this wouldn't work. It would be me and a bunch of my team doing little side projects, which is never going to do anything, right? It's got to be in the business, and that's how it works. And then the last point, I can't read my own writing. What was the last question?
Fishers.
Oh, fishermen. Everything we just said about farms, we're doing the same thing in fisheries and with fishermen and fisherwomen. Just for ease, we talk about farmers, but we mean both when we say that. So absolutely, right back to the fisheries, the environmental issues and the human issues. So there are big things that we're starting to learn about trafficking and slavery and everything right back in the chain. I think we as a society have to figure out, how do we get at that? And that's a big priority for us.
So does anybody want to add anything on waste? Waste is a huge issue. We could have spent this entire panel on waste, and we were trying to...
Can I just add something on waste? So I think, as you said, it's a third. We waste a third in every country in the world. But that third is actually equal to half of what we consume. It's also equal to half of the new food we have to produce by 2050. So waste is huge. But if you look at the greenhouse gas emissions of agriculture, food waste is 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions. It's 23% of all the fresh water we use, the food that is wasted. This is just atrocious, and it pushes prices down to producers and up to consumers at no benefit to anybody. So food waste is really something we've got to address.
Jocelyn?
Yeah, we focus in our work with Rockefeller on that 16% that's wasted in the field, and I think, you know, there's a few issues that are happening. One is that when farmers can't get a good price for that crop because the market is flooded, they choose to not bring the crop to market because it's just not worth it. And labor plays a pretty big role in this, which is that when you have mango trees that all need to be harvested, and this is the high time for mangoes, and mangoes are selling at a very low price point, are you really going to pay laborers to come and join you in harvesting these mangoes and bringing them to market? You're probably not. And so therefore the mangoes end up rotting in the field because it's more of an investment to actually bring them to market than it would be for what you're going to get. And I think another issue here is that when there's not real security in terms of who your buyer of this crop is, it oftentimes isn't worth it, or you're not able to find a buyer in the right period of time before that food spoils. So there's lots of challenges in terms of that linkage, the market linkage between the farmer and the local market.
A quick build on why the great opportunity on the waste side. So earlier this year I was visiting a client of ours in Peru that is part of a coca eradication effort, and it's Heart of Palm. And they had a trigger violation in our environmental due diligence where they were discarding their waste into the river. And we were like, you're going to be in default and we can't lend any more capital until you fix this. And the big part of fixing it is actually creating a closed loop system where they're using the organic waste to fuel their boilers.
Right.
And that's a terrific opportunity. You see that in coffee and all sorts of other processing. And one other thing, just want to make sure that we answer this one around the price premiums and scale. It's about, from a farmer's perspective, they will often trade a price premium for stability in income, and yield, productivity, volume, and resilience are the key thing. A price premium is fine, but much more better is to get your yields up and your quality and your volume. So you want to have all four, but the yield and the productivity is more important.
But that's where I think the certification programs that actually measure performance, increase efficiency, and what we found in every case that we've looked at the business case for this, producers make more money by being certified because they manage better, not because they get a premium. None of them get premiums anymore. That's gone.
One last quick point, because I'm gonna be so remiss if I don't mention it. Artisans. So artisanry is the other side of the coin of the rural economy, and it's super important. And being able to, and artisan and fishery both, where can you innovate in the more disintermediated, more robust supply chains of smallholder agriculture, however much hair they might have on them, to then bring that to what is in effect the tragedy of the commons in so many of the fisheries, and the supply chain reengineering and the access to capital and capacity building, and the same thing in the artisan sector. We're financing quite a bit of artisan businesses, weavers from like Franz up in northern Ghana and all sorts of textiles, et cetera, in Peru. But it's much, much more nascent and more difficult on demand side and all that. But these are adjacent markets that one can move into and kind of bring the innovation sandbox to these other areas.
So at the beginning of the forum, you were all asked, if you went to the opening plenary, to think of the impossible beliefs that you hold, that you would like to see come true, and to have conversations and try to work on enlisting others in helping achieve those. And so to close the panel, I've asked the panelists to share with you an impossible belief that they have for the food system that you may be able to help support the attainment of. So Willy, why don't you start?
Okay. She asked us this just as we walked in. So I guess my impossible dream would be, we have 500 million small-scale farmers in the world, as you mentioned. 300 million are non-commercial, non-surplus farmers. 165 million are surplus farmers, quasi-commercial, and very loose supply chains. And 35 million are in tight supply chains like coffee and cocoa. My dream would be that every single farmer in 50 years is organized into aggregators, where they're getting all sorts of services to be best in class, like our farmers are in the United States. and that they are all plugged into really tight, high value, value chains, like the kind of work that Kathleen has described.
Kathleen?
I share that dream, and I would just add that I dream of a world where we can meet that food demand in a way that is sustainable, where we haven't cut down all the forests, we haven't used all the water, and we haven't destroyed all of our ecosystems.
Jason?
So today, half of farm families can't feed themselves. My dream would be that by 2030, 15 years, small farmers can either feed themselves or have a viable alternative outside of farming. Because I think this romanticized notion that we have to maintain poverty by maintaining all the smallholders in the world is nonsense. I grew up in a small farm, less than $1 a day for 15 years in the US, so this is real. We need to let people have opportunities, not just try to fix them where they are.
Yeah, and I would build on that and say that my wish would be for us to redesign the brand of the smallholder farmer. I think that we think of them as sort of these poor, incapable people that don't necessarily have resources, and what that means is that as youth are graduating, they're not choosing to go into the profession of farming, they're choosing to go into cities instead. And so what if we as a community could redesign the brand of the smallholder farmer and make them really have local pride and a real desire, so that the smartest and brightest and best entrepreneurs are actually choosing to go into farming as a profession rather than seeing their future sit in the cities.
So I'll take the closing comment. I do all of my work at Stanford on transformation of the food system, because food is something that impacts every one of us every day if we're lucky. And every one of you has an opportunity through your individual food choices, and also many of you through your work and your opportunity to impact others in the food system to help achieve these visions. And I would challenge you to seriously seize that and help make progress. Thank you for being a wonderful audience.